The truth doesn't always scream. It waits, silent and subtle, until you're too far in to turn back. A boy, desperate to save a millionaire from an unseen danger, unknowingly steps into a world where rules are illusions. What seemed like a simple warning quickly becomes a fight for survival. In this game, innocence isn't just lost. It's shattered before you even realize it's gone. This is just starting. Sit back and watch. It was a quiet morning at the airport. The hangars stood far apart, like forgotten relics of a world once in constant motion. The air was filled with the hum of distant engines, the low murmur of workers on the tarmac, and the occasional screech of a plane's wheels against the runway. It was the kind of place that was always bustling, but in the early hours, it felt almost deserted. The sky, a soft shade of gray, seemed to stretch endlessly, a canvas painted with possibility. Steve, a young boy of no more than 16, was sitting on a worn-out bench near Gate 12. He wasn't supposed to be there, but the airport was close to his house, and he often wandered through the terminal after school. He liked the feeling of the place, the sense of movement, the mystery of where people were going or why they were leaving. He dreamed of far-off lands, of places he would never go, but he was happy just to watch. Today, however, something felt different. A figure in the distance caught his eye. It was a man, tall and confident, wearing a sharp suit, walking briskly across the tarmac towards his private jet. Steve had seen him before on TV. His name was Joe, Sir Joe, a millionaire businessman known for his success in the tech industry, a man who seemed to have everything. Steve's attention sharpened as he watched Joe's entourage of assistants and security. Everything seemed too clean, too perfect. Joe was untouchable, like a character in one of the stories Steve used to read about kings and conquerors, men who ruled from their thrones of power. Yet there was something about this moment that felt wrong. A twinge of discomfort ran through Steve's chest. He couldn't explain it, but something about the way Joe was walking, his rigid posture, and the way the flight staff hurried around him set Steve on edge. He shook his head, trying to focus, but his thoughts kept swirling. Why did he feel like this? It didn't make sense. He leaned forward, squinting toward the jet. It was sleek, shiny, and just a little too pristine. The sun reflected off its surface, almost blinding him. But that wasn't what bothered him. It was the way the staff was moving around it, too fast, too anxious, as though they were trying to cover something up. Steve didn't know anything about planes, but he knew enough to recognize when people were hiding something. He had been to this airport countless times, but he had never seen anyone act like this before. Not with a plane that important. Something was wrong. He stood up abruptly, the idea forming in his mind with an urgency he couldn't shake. He didn't know why, but he couldn't ignore the feeling deep in his gut. He had to warn Joe. Even if he was just a boy, even if it didn't make sense, he had to say something. His heart pounded in his chest as he started walking toward the plane, not even thinking about the consequences. He had never done anything like this before, never felt such an instinct to act without question. But something told him he couldn't let this chance slip away. As he approached, the flight staff, dressed in dark uniforms with sharp lines and tense expressions, took no notice of him. They were too busy with their tasks. Steve hesitated for a moment, but then pushed forward. He reached the tarmac, a few meters away from where Joe stood, still unaware. Without thinking, he shouted, "Your plane was sabotage. Don't fly. It's not safe." The words echoed louder than he expected, as though the ground itself was shaking beneath him. The staff stopped. For a second, everything froze. Then, Joe turned, his eyes narrowing. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, his voice hard and sharp, a commanding edge that matched his powerful presence. Steve froze. The man's gaze was like a physical force, pulling him into place, making him feel small and insignificant. But he couldn't back down now. "I saw something," Steve said, his voice shaking. "I don't know what, but something's wrong. Your plane isn't safe. Please, Don't go." For a moment, Joe stared at him, disbelief clouding his face. He was a man used to control, to being in charge, and here was this boy, standing in front of him, telling him not to fly. "You need to go," Joe said, his tone icy. "Get out of my way." Steve stood still for a moment, looking into Joe's eyes, but the millionaire's gaze was unwavering. Slowly, Steve stepped aside, his heart sinking. Joe's team moved quickly to get him on the plane, dismissing Steve's warning as a nuisance. Steve watched as the doors closed, the jet engines revved, and the plane began to roll down the runway. But he didn't feel relief. He only felt a deep sense of foreboding, the feeling that something terrible was going to happen. He stood there for a long time after the plane took off, his mind racing. The hours dragged by after the plane had taken off. Steve walked aimlessly through the terminal, his thoughts spinning in circles. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had gone terribly wrong. He kept replaying the events in his mind, over and over, like a bad dream that he couldn't wake from. Why had he shouted? Why had he even cared enough to warn Joe? He was just a kid. What difference could his words possibly have made? But deep down, he knew the answer. He had to say something. He had to do something. It wasn't just about Joe or his plane. It was about the gut feeling, the unease that had settled in his stomach and wouldn't let go. Still, Steve couldn't help but feel foolish. Joe had brushed him off like a fly. What did he know about airplanes? Nothing. What did he know about sabotage? Nothing. It had just been a random thought that had come to him. Nothing more. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking time that seemed to stretch endlessly. The hum of distant engines and the occasional shuffling of staff were the only sounds breaking the silence. Steve had never felt so out of place. He walked toward the exit, his mind clouded with frustration. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe the plane was fine. After all, Joe was a businessman. He wouldn't put his life in danger, would he? But Steve couldn't shake the image of Joe's cold, dismissive stare. He couldn't shake the sense that he had been right, that something was wrong. An hour later, the phone rang. Steve had been expecting it. In some way, he had known that the moment would come. His mom's face was pale when she answered, her eyes wide with shock. She handed the phone to Steve without a word. It was the news. The plane had gone down. The crash site was in a remote part of the woods, far from any civilian area. There had been no survivors. The wreckage was scattered across the forest floor, twisted metal and broken glass, charred remains of what had once been a plane of luxury. Steve's stomach dropped. He stood there in stunned silence, the weight of the news settling heavily on his chest. His mind raced. How could he have been so sure? He hadn't been able to explain it at the time, but now it made sense. Joe, Sir Joe, the businessman he had tried to warn, was dead. His team, his staff, all of them, gone. Steve's hands shook as he put down the phone. He couldn't stop thinking about the way he had felt earlier, the way something had been wrong, even before he knew it. Had he known? Had he really sensed it, or had it been some twisted coincidence? The doubt gnawed at him. He paced back and forth, trying to make sense of it all. Could it really be that simple? A boy's hunch, a gut feeling, had saved the life. Or had it just been blind luck? His phone buzzed again. It was a text from a number he didn't recognize. "Meet me at the old diner. I need to talk to you." Steve stared at the message for a long time before replying. Who could it be? Who would be looking for him? He had never been involved in anything like this, never in his life. But something told him this was no ordinary message. It felt urgent. It felt important. He took a deep breath, grabbed his jacket, and left the house. The streets were quiet, empty at this hour. The wind was cool against his skin, and the air carried a faint smell of rain. It was as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for something. The diner was a few miles out of town, a small dusty building tucked between two rundown stores. It wasn't a place anyone would choose to visit, but it had been Steve's favorite spot for late-night snacks when he was younger. It was always quiet, a place where no one bothered to ask questions. As Steve approached the diner, he saw a figure sitting by the window, watching him. A tall man in a dark coat. Steve hesitated for a moment, but then he stepped inside. The man looked up as he entered. He was older, perhaps in his 40s, with a face that was both familiar and strange. It took Steve a moment to place him, but then it hit him. This was one of Joe's security men. The man who had been watching over Joe at the airport. The man who had brushed Steve off like he was nothing. "You're the boy from the airport," the man said, his voice low and steady. There was no anger in his tone, just an unsettling calm. Steve nodded, his throat dry. He didn't know what to say. He didn't even know why he was there. "Sit down," the man said. Steve took a seat across from him, unsure of what was happening. "First, I need to thank you," the man continued, his eyes never leaving Steve's. "You saved my boss's life, and I owe you that. But you need to understand something." Steve's heart skipped a beat. He was still trying to process everything that had happened, and now this man was thanking him. For what? He hadn't saved anyone. He had just shouted a warning. It could have been nothing. A coincidence. "You're the only one who saw it, the only one who heard it. The sabotage, the plans, the mistakes," the man said, his voice dropping lower. "You're the only one who could have stopped it." Steve's mind raced. What was he talking about? What sabotage? He had no idea what this man was referring to. His warning had been based on nothing more than a hunch, a feeling. "You're involved in something bigger now," the man continued. "And whether you want to be or not, it's too late. There's no going back." Steve's head was spinning. Steve sat there, staring at the man across the table, his mind still in a fog. Everything that had just happened felt surreal, like a movie that was playing too fast for him to catch up. His stomach churned, and he felt a growing sense of dread creeping up his spine. The man's expression didn't change. He didn't seem bothered by the weight of his words, as though this was all part of a script he'd recited many times before. "Do you know what sabotage means, kid?" The man's voice was calm, even almost conversational, but the words hit Steve like a punch. I think so. But why are you saying that?" Steve's voice came out smaller than he expected. He hated how weak it sounded, but everything was happening too fast. He had barely even processed the news of the crash, let alone the fact that someone was sitting here telling him he was somehow involved in it. The man leaned back in his seat, crossing his arms. "You're the only one who noticed. You're the only one who had the nerve to speak up. That makes you the one who knows the truth. And the truth, well, it's not something anyone wants to hear." Steve swallowed hard, but he didn't speak. The man's words hung in the air, heavy with something Steve couldn't quite grasp. "Joe was never supposed to make that flight," the man said, his voice dropping into a lower register. "He was supposed to die." The words felt like they cracked something inside Steve, like a barrier he hadn't even realized existed was shattered with a single sentence. His hands started to shake, and he tried to steady himself by gripping the edge of the table. He couldn't process it. Joe, the man who had dismissed him, the man who had been so untouchable, wasn't just a victim of an accident. He had been the target of something much darker. "But I don't understand. How could I have known? I didn't know what was happening." Steve stammered, his thoughts a jumbled mess. The man's gaze softened slightly, though it was hard to tell if it was sympathy or something else entirely. "You felt it. That's the thing. People like Joe, they think they can control everything. They don't see the cracks in the system until it's too late. You were just a kid, but you picked up on something most adults would have missed." Steve shook his head. "But I didn't know. How could I have known about the sabotage? I didn't see anything, didn't hear anything. I just felt wrong. It was just a hunch." The man nodded slowly, as if he'd been expecting this reaction. That's how it works. People like Joe, they think they're untouchable. They think they can fly above everyone else, but they forget that sometimes the smallest things can bring them down. You were right, Steve. The plane was tampered with. The tiny, nearly invisible part was altered, just enough to cause a failure in the engine. If he had flown, the crash would have been inevitable. Steve's head was spinning. He had no idea what to think, no idea what this man was talking about. All he had known, all he had trusted, was the feeling in his gut that something wasn't right. And that was it. It had been instinct, not knowledge, not evidence. He had shouted, but how could he have known what had been tampered with? The man's expression hardened again, and he leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. Here's the thing, kid. The sabotage wasn't just a random act. It wasn't someone just trying to bring down a plane. This was planned. This was calculated. And Joe, he wasn't just anyone. He was the target because he was involved in something far bigger than himself. Steve blinked, his heart racing. Bigger than himself? What does that even mean? The man's eyes narrowed, his lips curling into a grim smile. The crash wasn't the end, Steve. It was just the beginning. The hairs on the back of Steve's neck stood on end. He couldn't tell if the man was messing with him, or if something much darker was going on. The world felt too big, too complicated for him to understand. And yet here he was, standing at the center of it, with no choice but to listen. I didn't just save a man's life, Steve said, more to himself than to the man. His mind was still working through the puzzle. I stopped something bigger. But why me? Why did it have to be me? Because, the man answered, his voice cold and matter-of-fact. You were the one who listened to that gut feeling. You were the one who wasn't afraid to stand up and say something when everyone else kept their mouths shut. That's why you. Steve felt a sinking sensation in his stomach, as if the ground beneath him was shifting. He had never asked for this. He had never wanted to be part of something bigger. All he wanted was to keep his head down, to escape into his daydreams of far-off places. But now he was here. And whether he liked it or not, he had been drawn into something much larger than he could have imagined. The man stood up suddenly, his movement sharp. You're not just a kid anymore. You're part of something, Steve. And whether you want to be or not, you're now a player in a game you don't fully understand. You've seen the cracks in the system. And once you see them, you can't unsee them. Steve felt like he was drowning in this new reality, suffocating under the weight of the truth that was coming at him too fast. He hadn't even known he had a part to play. He was just a kid who had seen something wrong, something that didn't make sense. But now it felt like everything was falling apart. What do you want from me? Steve finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man paused, looking at him with a cold, calculating gaze. You'll find out soon enough. The world's a big place, kid. And there's a lot of people who will do whatever it takes to protect their interests. But now you know too much. Steve felt his pulse quicken. What does that mean? The man didn't answer immediately. He just turned, walking towards the door. He glanced back over his shoulder. Stay out of trouble, Steve. You've already made your choice. Then, without another word, he left. Steve sat there, feeling more alone than ever. The empty diner, the quiet streets outside, the distant hum of the world moving on without him. All of it felt suddenly so alien. He had wanted nothing more than to remain invisible, to slip through life unnoticed. But now, everything had changed. Steve sat in the diner long after the man had left. His hands were still trembling, but now it was a different kind of shake. It was the tremor of confusion, of fear, and something deeper, something far more uncomfortable. It was the kind of feeling that you get when you realize you've been swept into something you don't fully understand, but you can't turn back now. The man's words echoed in Steve's mind. Once you see the cracks, you can't unsee them. That thought gnawed at him, pulling at his insides. What cracks? Was it the plain sabotage, or was it something bigger? How had his hunch, his gut feeling, turned into something so dangerous? The clock on the wall ticked away the minutes, its rhythmic sound louder now in the empty diner. He had to leave. He had to go home. But home felt farther away than it ever had before. What was he going back to? The same life? Or was he already too deep into this strange mess that had started with a single, impulsive shout? Steve stood up, his legs stiff from sitting too long. He didn't bother to look around before leaving. There was no one in the diner to stop him, no one to answer his questions. The cold night air hit him as soon as he stepped outside, the chill slicing through his thin jacket. He wrapped his arms tighter around his body and walked toward the bus stop. There were too many things on his mind, too many possibilities. What had the man meant when he said that the crash was just the beginning? What had Joe really been involved in? All Steve knew for sure was that the man had looked at him like he was already part of something bigger, a game he hadn't even known existed. The bus ride back home felt long and empty. The streets passed by in a blur, each block and building fading in and out of his vision. Steve couldn't focus on anything. His eyes kept darting from one streetlight to the next, as if looking for something, anything, that could make sense of it all. When the bus finally pulled up to his stop, Steve stepped off and walked the short distance to his house. The night was quiet, still, but it felt like the world around him was slowly shifting, like things were changing whether he wanted them to or not. He entered his house and kicked off his shoes, but the usual comfort of his small home was gone. The walls that had once felt so familiar now felt cold, like he was an outsider. He tossed his jacket onto the couch and went straight to his room, locking the door behind him. It was the only place where he felt like he could still control something. But even in his own room, Steve couldn't escape the thoughts swirling in his mind. His eyes flicked to the corner of the room, where a small old radio sat on a shelf. It had been his father's. He'd never been close to his dad, but the radio was something he had kept after his father's passing. It was one of the few things that had any kind of meaning to him, a relic of a past he barely remembered. Steve sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the radio. A few weeks ago, he would have just turned it on to drown out the noise in his head. But tonight, the silence was too loud. He didn't want to hear the static. He didn't want to hear anything. Then, the phone rang. Steve froze. He hadn't been expecting a call, not after everything that had happened. His stomach churned as he grabbed the phone, expecting the worst. Maybe it was the man from the diner again. Maybe it was someone else who knew too much. But when he answered, the voice on the other end was unfamiliar, yet strangely calm. "Steve, this is Thomas Blackwell." Steve's heart skipped a beat. The name felt heavy. Blackwell. He had heard it before. Joe's company. Blackwell Enterprises. But who was this man? Why was he calling? "Who are you?" Steve asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I think you already know," Blackwell said. There was a slight smile in his tone, one that Steve couldn't place. It didn't feel friendly. "I'm with the organization. The one your friend Joe was involved with." Steve's mind reeled. The organization. He had never heard of it, but something told him that it was exactly what the man had meant when he talked about things far beyond Joe. "What do you want with me?" "We want to make sure you're okay, Steve," Blackwell replied, his voice softening a bit. "You've seen the cracks, haven't you? You've noticed the things that are wrong with the world. You're not just an innocent bystander anymore. You've been pulled into something you can't get out of. And that's why I'm here. To give you a choice." Steve felt a knot tighten in his chest. This wasn't what he wanted. This wasn't what he'd asked for. He'd just been trying to go home, trying to forget about everything that had happened. But now, he was caught in something far deeper than he could have imagined. "What choice?" Steve's voice was barely audible, his throat dry. "You can walk away," Blackwell said. "You can pretend nothing happened. Pretend you didn't hear the warning. didn't see the sabotage. But there are consequences. There are always consequences. Or you can take the knowledge you have and come with us. Help us make things right. The choice is yours, Steve. But you need to decide quickly. Steve's head was spinning. He could hear the distant hum of the city outside, the usual noises of the night. But inside, it felt like everything was suffocating him. He had been just a kid who had a hunch. He had no place in this world of conspiracies and high-stakes decisions. But somehow, it didn't matter anymore. He wasn't the same boy who had wandered into the airport with no thoughts beyond the ordinary. Something had changed. Something inside him had woken up. "I'll think about it," Steve said, his voice firm despite the storm brewing inside of him. Blackwell paused for a moment, as if gauging Steve's sincerity. "You don't have much time. Think quickly." The line went dead, and Steve sat in silence, staring at the phone in his hand. The choice had been laid out before him, and whether he liked it or not, his life was no longer just his own. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach. The game had begun, and there was no going back now. As he lay back on his bed, the weight of everything pressing down on him, Steve realized the truth. The cracks hadn't just appeared. They had always been there. He had just been the first one to notice. And now he had to decide whether to live in them or shatter them altogether. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting long shadows across Steve's room. He hadn't slept. His mind raced all night, the thoughts swirling in a dizzying spiral. Every time he closed his eyes, the conversation with Blackwell replayed in his head. The same choices, the same consequences. Steve sat up in bed, rubbing his face with both hands. His phone still sat on his desk where he'd left it, as if daring him to pick it up again, to make a choice, to enter a world he didn't understand but couldn't avoid. He wasn't ready for this. He wasn't even sure if he wanted to be ready. But the more he thought about it, the more something inside him started to harden. The weight of the decision settled on him like a stone. He had no more time to sit and wonder. This wasn't a game where he could sit on the sidelines. He'd already been pulled in, and the world had no intention of letting him go. His stomach twisted, but this time it wasn't just nerves. It was a kind of resolve. He had always known, deep down, that things weren't as simple as they appeared. People like Joe, people who were untouchable, they lived in a world of lies, of manipulation. And somehow, Steve had been given a glimpse into that world. He couldn't unsee it, and now he had to decide what to do with it. The phone buzzed, breaking his train of thought. It was Blackwell. "You've made your choice, then," the voice on the other end asked, the calmness in it like a soft threat. Steve swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I don't know if I've made it yet," he said, his voice shaky but resolute. "But I want to know what you want me to do." "You're not as naive as I thought," Blackwell said, a faint amusement in his voice. "I'll be coming to see you in person. There's much you need to understand, Steve. And this conversation, it's just the beginning." The call ended abruptly, leaving Steve staring at his phone in disbelief. He'd expected the conversation to be a test, a way to gauge his readiness. But he hadn't expected it to happen so quickly. The moment had arrived, and now he was left to wait for Blackwell to show up. Steve wasn't sure what was more unsettling, the unknown future or the realization that he had been right all along. He hadn't made any decisions yet, hadn't truly chosen to walk into this world. But in some ways, his gut had already made up its mind. There were no easy answers, no easy ways out, and no matter how much he resisted, his life was now intertwined with something far larger than himself. Hours passed, but they felt like days. The world outside his window remained unchanged, people going about their business, oblivious to the storm that had already begun to gather around Steve. The normal world felt distant now. He felt like a stranger in his own skin. Finally, there was a knock on his door. Steve froze, his heart skipping a beat. It was too soon. He wasn't ready. But he had no choice. He stood up slowly and walked to the door. each step heavier than the last. He opened it just enough to peek out, and there stood Blackwell, tall, calm, and carrying the air of a man who had all the answers. The man had a way of looking at you, like you were both insignificant and incredibly important at the same time. "Can I come in?" Blackwell asked, his voice smooth as silk. Steve didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped back and let Blackwell enter. The man didn't wait for an invitation. He walked into the room as if he belonged there, like he had been a part of Steve's life all along. "Let's get something straight, Steve," Blackwell said as soon as he closed the door behind him. "You have no idea what you're about to step into. But you're already in it, whether you like it or not. The question now is how you want to play the hand you've been dealt." Steve felt the weight of the words settle in. "I don't even know what you want from me. What am I supposed to do?" Blackwell chuckled softly. "I don't need you to do anything yet, but you need to understand something. You didn't just save Joe's life. You saved a lot of people, maybe even the world. But the moment you spoke up, you became a target. There are people who don't like loose ends, Steve. And you, my friend, are a very loose end." The room felt smaller now, as if the walls were closing in around him. Steve's pulse quickened. The game he'd been unknowingly thrust into had rules he couldn't even begin to understand. "You're talking like I'm some kind of hero," Steve said, his voice rising. "But I didn't do anything. I just shouted. I didn't even know what I was shouting about." Blackwell's smile was cold. "That's the point, kid. You didn't need to know. You were the one who noticed. You saw something out of place, and that's enough. In a world like this, it's not about being smart or knowing the right answers. It's about seeing the things that others overlook. You've seen the cracks, Steve. You've seen the corruption, the flaws in the system." Steve's mind reeled. He felt like he was being pulled into something he couldn't escape from. But what was it? What was the system they were talking about? Was it the government? The corporations? Joe's company? He didn't know, and the more he heard, the less he understood. "You're saying it's my responsibility now?" Steve asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Blackwell leaned forward, his gaze intense. "No. I'm saying that you have to decide what your responsibility is. You can walk away, pretend it was all a mistake, or you can stay and help us change the system. But either way, this isn't over." Steve felt his head spin. The weight of it all was pressing on him, suffocating him. He had wanted nothing more than to stay invisible, to slip through life unnoticed. But now he couldn't go back to who he was. The boy who had shouted out of instinct was gone. The boy who had just wanted to be left alone was gone too. The man in front of him wasn't giving him a choice. Not really. Blackwell wasn't asking him to decide. He was telling him that the decision had already been made. The door to his old life had closed, and now Steve had to find his way in this new chaotic world. As Blackwell turned to leave, he paused at the door. "Remember, Steve, you can't unsee the cracks, and you can't walk away from them either." Then he was gone, leaving Steve alone with the weight of the choices ahead. And for the first time, Steve realized that the cracks in the world were not something he could fix. They were something he had to live with, and somehow he had to decide whether to embrace them or let them consume him. The choice was his, but in the end, maybe that was the biggest illusion of all. Steve sat in the silence of his room, the weight of Blackwell's words pressing on his chest. The ticking of the clock was the only sound that filled the empty space. Outside, the world continued, indifferent to the turmoil inside him. His phone sat on the desk still. It was as if the whole world was waiting for him to make the next move. But what was that move? He had no idea. The days blurred together. The clock moved forward, but Steve remained stuck in place, trapped in the heavy fog of confusion. He couldn't ignore what he'd learned, what he had been dragged into, but he also couldn't see a way forward. There was no roadmap, just Blackwell's cryptic words and the shadow of Joe hanging over everything. The phone call that rattled him. Blackwell was clear. Steve was no longer an outsider to this world. He was in it, whether he wanted to be or not. And that left him in an uncomfortable position. He had to make a decision. But how could he decide? He wasn't a hero. He wasn't cut out for anything like this. It was early one morning when the knock came again. This time, Steve wasn't surprised. His pulse quickened, but he forced himself to stand, to face what was coming. He opened the door without hesitation, and there stood a figure in a dark suit, clean, composed, but somehow unsettling. "Mr. Blackwell is expecting you," the man said. His voice was smooth, cold. "We need to move quickly." Before Steve could speak, the man stepped inside, his presence filling the room. "Are you ready to come with me?" he asked, his tone not leaving much room for debate. Steve's first instinct was to refuse, to tell the man to leave, to pretend none of this was happening. But his body betrayed him. The words stuck in his throat, and instead, he nodded, albeit reluctantly. "Good," the man said. He didn't smile. There was no comfort in his expression, just the dull certainty of someone who knew exactly where they were headed and why. "It's time." They walked out of the apartment in silence, the chill of the early morning air biting into Steve's skin. It didn't feel real. This was too fast, too sudden. One moment he was a boy trying to figure out what to do with his life, and now he was walking into a world he couldn't even comprehend. The man led him through the quiet streets, and the closer they got to the edge of town, the darker it felt. The city's usual hustle and bustle seemed miles away, swallowed by the weight of the unknown. Steve tried to find something to hold on to, a landmark, a familiar street, but everything felt alien. He was adrift. They'd reached a nondescript van parked along the side of the road. The man opened the door, gesturing for Steve to get in. Without a word, Steve climbed inside. The van was old, its interior worn with age. There was a flicker of light from a small bulb above, casting strange shadows on the walls. The air was thick with something Steve couldn't place. Fear, uncertainty, or something darker. The man shut the door behind him, and the van jolted to life. They drove in silence, the hum of the engine and the soft crunch of tires on the road filling the empty spaces. Steve tried to settle his nerves, but each passing minute made him feel more lost, more trapped. It was impossible to keep track of time as the van turned off the main roads and into a stretch of barren land. They passed small, empty houses and faded billboards that no one seemed to care about anymore. It was all so ordinary, yet it felt so wrong. Steve had never been this far from his usual path. There was no turning back now. Finally, the van slowed, coming to a stop in front of a warehouse. The building was large, its windows covered with dark shades, blocking any light from inside. It was quiet here, too quiet. The hairs on the back of Steve's neck stood up. "Get out," the man said, his voice even more detached now, as if this was just a part of his routine. Steve obeyed, stepping out onto the cold concrete. The man led him through a side door, down a narrow corridor, and into a small, dimly lit room. A chair sat in the center, and a table with scattered papers was against the far wall. In the corner, a large map of the world hung, dotted with pins and lines. Blackwell was sitting at the table, the calmness in his eyes unchanged. He didn't stand up when Steve entered, but there was a slight shift in his posture, a quiet acknowledgement. Steve looked around, still feeling the weight of everything. "What is this place?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "This is where we get things done," Blackwell said simply. His gaze flicked to the map, then back to Steve. "Where things change." Steve was about to ask more questions, but the man who had brought him here stepped forward and placed a folder on the table. "This is what you're dealing with, Steve." Blackwell opened the folder, revealing a series of photographs, images of people Steve didn't recognize. Some of them were public figures, others less well known, but all of them had one thing in common. They were connected to a vast network of corruption and deceit. "These are the players," Blackwell said, his voice low. "The people who hold power and use it for their own gain. They think they're untouchable, but they're wrong. That's where you come in." Steve's confusion deepened. "I don't know these people," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "No, but you will," Blackwell said. "It's not about knowing them. It's about understanding how they operate and how you can expose them. You've seen the cracks in the system, Steve. You've seen how fragile it really is." Steve felt his chest tighten. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think clearly. This was bigger than he had imagined. He had thought he was just helping Joe, just saving him from something he couldn't name. But now it felt like the entire world had been exposed. Every hidden thing, every lie, every manipulative action. "These people are more dangerous than you realize," Blackwell continued. "But they won't expect you, Steve. That's the advantage you have. They think you're just a boy who made a lucky guess. But you're not. You're something far more valuable." Steve stood frozen, staring at the photos. He didn't know what was happening. He didn't know what he was supposed to do. "You can choose to walk away," Blackwell said softly, almost as a whisper. "But then you'll never know the truth. You'll never see what's really behind the curtain. The question is, do you want to see, Steve? Do you want to know what's really out there?" The weight of the decision hung heavily in the air. For the first time, Steve realized just how dangerous his next step would be. There were no guarantees, no safety nets. He would either be part of the system, or he would be crushed by it. And so, in the silence of that cold, dark room, Steve made a choice. The choice hung in the air like a knife poised above a rope, and Steve felt the tension in every fiber of his body. Blackwell's words had settled in deep, twisting around him, pulling him in every direction. The room around him was silent now, oppressive. The walls, with their shadows, seemed to close in, suffocating him with the gravity of what he was about to face. He stood there, the photos spread out before him, a chaotic map of connections that made his head spin. Powerful people, dangerous people, some familiar, some not. Some smiling on the front pages of newspapers, others hidden behind closed doors, their identities shrouded in secrecy. What had he walked into? And what was he supposed to do with this information? He was just a boy, a nobody. He couldn't possibly bring down something this big, could he? Blackwell's voice interrupted his spiraling thoughts. "You're wondering if you can do this, aren't you?" Steve looked up at the older man, trying to hide the fear he could feel seeping through his veins. "I don't know if I can," he admitted, the weight of his words more honest than he intended. "I didn't ask for this." Blackwell smiled slightly, but there was no humor in it. "No one asks for this. That's the mistake most people make, thinking they can opt out of what they see. But once you've seen it, you can't go back. Not without paying the price. And the price, Steve, is ignorance. Willful ignorance. That's the price of safety." Steve's stomach churned. His throat was dry. He felt as though the walls were closing in, suffocating him. He wanted to scream, to run away, but there was nowhere to run anymore. He had stepped into something, and there was no going back. Blackwell leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him. "You were right to speak up the other day. You did what most wouldn't, and that's what makes you valuable. But now, it's time to do more. You'll need to learn how this system operates, how to navigate it, how to use it. Because you're not just a pawn here, Steve. You're an agent of change. But only if you understand the system, and understanding it requires you to get your hands dirty." Steve's mind raced. "Dirty," he repeated, the word hanging in the air. I'm not like that." "No," Blackwell said. "You're not. Not yet. But that's why you're here. To learn. To see. You're not in control of this situation, Steve. The moment you shouted that warning, you became part of it. And now you have to adapt. People like Joe don't make it to the top without stepping on others. without doing things that most wouldn't, without getting their hands dirty. Steve's heart raced. He felt like he was being pulled deeper into a hole, and the harder he fought against it, the faster he sank. His breath caught in his throat. He felt like a puppet, his strings being pulled tighter and tighter with every passing second. "I'm just a kid," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't ask for any of this." Blackwell nodded slowly. "None of us do. That's what makes it so effective. The people who pull the strings, the ones who run the world, they know exactly how to manipulate those like you. They don't ask for anything from you. They just let you stumble into their web. And when you do, they make sure you stay there. You see too much to walk away. You know too much." The weight of Blackwell's words crashed down on Steve. He felt the crushing burden of understanding. The world wasn't as simple as he had thought. There were no heroes or villains, just people trying to survive, using whatever tools they had at their disposal. And now Steve had been thrust into that world, his survival tied to his ability to navigate it. He sat down in the chair across from Blackwell, trying to collect his thoughts, trying to find some semblance of clarity in the midst of the storm inside him. "What do I do now?" he asked, his voice barely a murmur. "Now," Blackwell said, leaning forward, "we start by watching, learning who is really in control. You think Joe is the one running the show, don't you? That he's the one calling the shots. But he's not. Not even close." Steve blinked, trying to understand. "What do you mean?" Blackwell slid another folder across the table. It was thinner than the first one, but the pages inside were equally as dense with information. This time, the faces on the pages weren't people Steve had ever seen before. They were older, hidden. Some of them were wearing suits, others in plain clothes, but there was something common in their eyes, something cold, calculating. "These are the real players," Blackwell said, "the ones pulling the strings from the shadows. They don't make a public appearance. They don't need to. But they run everything. Joe, for all his power, is just a pawn. He's a tool. And the people who control him, they use him to further their own agendas." Steve picked up the folder, flipping through the pages slowly, absorbing the names and faces that now blurred in front of him. Each person in these photos had their own complicated web of influence and connections. People who sat at the top of corporations, in government offices, and behind closed doors, dictating the rules the rest of the world followed. "How do I fit into all of this?" Steve asked, his voice filled with disbelief. "I'm not part of this world. I don't belong here." "You belong here because you're the one who saw the truth," Blackwell said, his voice low, almost reverential. "You saw the cracks. You're the one who noticed Joe's flight had been sabotage before anyone else did. That's rare. And rare things are valuable. You're not just some bystander. You're part of something much bigger now. And whether you like it or not, the truth will follow you. It will consume you." Steve's chest tightened. It was too much, too fast. He didn't want to be a part of this. He wanted to go home, to forget all of it, to erase the feeling of knowing that this world existed. But there was no escape now. He had seen too much, and Blackwell was right. Once you saw the cracks, you couldn't unsee them. "You're going to have to decide what you want, Steve," Blackwell said quietly. "What kind of person you want to be. Because the moment you let this world into your life, it changes you. And no one walks away from it without a price." The weight of his words hung in the air, a silent promise of what was to come. Steve had no choice but to listen. He couldn't walk away now. Not anymore. The web was closing in, and Steve was caught right in the middle of it. The days blurred together. Time seemed irrelevant now, like an old movie reel with frames that barely lined up. Steve couldn't shake the weight of the decision Blackwell had laid on his shoulders. Every moment since that first night, when he warned Joe, felt like a path he hadn't chosen, but had been forced down. He had stepped into a world of shadows, where nothing was as it seemed. In the small, dimly lit room, The map of connections and faces on the wall became a constant reminder of his place in all this. But the more Steve stared at it, the more something began to gnaw at him. Blackwell's world wasn't his world. It was a world of manipulation, where people with power pulled strings and danced in the shadows. The more he learned about it, the more he realized he wasn't just caught in the system. He was becoming part of it, and that scared him. One morning, Steve stood before the mirror, trying to clear his thoughts. The reflection staring back at him didn't feel like his anymore. He was thinner, his face drawn and pale from sleepless nights. He'd hardly spoken to anyone outside of Blackwell or the strange men who worked for him. His life had narrowed to this, a world where choices felt like lies, and the truth was a weapon meant for those strong enough to wield it. He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. What was I supposed to do now? Was this the life he had been forced into? No, he didn't want it. He couldn't live like this. The knock on the door shattered the stillness, pulling Steve from his thoughts. He knew it was Blackwell or someone working for him, but that didn't ease the tension building in his chest. Every interaction with Blackwell felt like stepping closer to something dark, and the longer he stayed in this world, the harder it would be to walk away. When Steve opened the door, Blackwell wasn't there. Instead, it was the man who had brought him to the warehouse that day, the one with the cold, expressionless face. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, staring at Steve with those unreadable eyes. "You're coming with me," the man said finally. No questions, no discussion. Steve's mind raced. He wanted to refuse, but what was the point? He had already made the decision the moment he'd stepped into this world. He was too far gone to back out now. He nodded and stepped out, the heavy silence following him as they walked to the waiting car. The drive was long, but it felt like nothing at all, just the slow, numbing crawl of time. When the car finally stopped, they were back at the warehouse. Steve felt the familiar unease creeping up his spine. But this time, it was different. This wasn't just another meeting. He could feel it in the air. Something was about to happen. Inside, Blackwell was waiting, sitting at the same table, looking as calm as ever. But Steve could tell something was different. Blackwell's eyes were sharp, not as disinterested as before. Something important was coming. "You're here because you've been chosen," Blackwell said without preamble, his voice almost clinical. "You've seen the way things work. You've felt it. The cracks, the corruption, the power of those who control everything. But now, Steve, it's time to decide what kind of man you want to be." Steve's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" Blackwell motioned to the table. This time, there were no photos. Instead, there was a single piece of paper. It was simple, unassuming. But Steve knew better than to think it was anything less than a decision of monumental importance. "This is an offer," Blackwell said. "An offer for you to step into the world, to claim your place in it. There's no going back once you sign. You'll be in control. You'll have the power to change things. But the price is steep." Steve felt his heart race, his hands suddenly slick with sweat. This was the moment where his life would be rewritten. Blackwell continued, "I won't lie to you. You'll have to take part in things you may not agree with. You'll have to make tough decisions. But in the end, it's the only way to truly change anything. You can choose to fight from the inside, or you can choose to walk away and stay a spectator for the rest of your life. The question is, Steve, what are you willing to do?" The offer sat on the table like a contract. He could feel it, the gravity of the decision. The choice would shape everything from this point forward. Was he ready for it? Was he willing to cross that line? Blackwell leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "You've already seen how fragile the system is, how easily it can break. The question now is, will you be the one to fix it, or will you watch it crumble?" The silence in the room was deafening, the pressure mounting with each passing second. Steve stood frozen, torn between the two paths laid out before him. On one side was the promise of power, of control, of being someone who could change the world. On the other, the simple life he had known before all of this, the life where ignorance was a shield and innocence was a luxury. But the truth was, Steve couldn't go back. Not after everything he had seen, everything he had learned. The world was broken, and he had been given a chance to fix it. The cost would be high, but the cost of staying out of it was even higher. I don't know if I'm ready," Steve said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "You won't be," Blackwell replied, the ghost of a smile on his lips. "No one is. But that's the point. This isn't about being ready. It's about stepping up when you're needed. The world doesn't wait for you to be ready. It takes what it needs. And now, it needs you." Steve felt a cold, bitter clarity in that moment. The world didn't care about his doubts. It didn't care about his fear. It was bigger than him, bigger than anyone. It was a force that would crush him if he didn't act. He reached for the pen on the table, his fingers trembling. And in that moment, Steve understood the truth. The world didn't just need him. It needed someone like him, someone willing to make the hard choices. He signed. The ink was still drying on the paper when Steve felt the weight of his decision settle in. It wasn't a feeling of triumph, but rather a crushing sense of inevitability. He had signed the contract. There was no turning back now. He had entered the game, but the rules were different here. Rules he had yet to fully understand. Blackwell watched him with cold, calculating eyes, as though he were waiting for Steve to show any sign of hesitation. But Steve didn't look up. He couldn't bring himself to. His gaze remained fixed on the paper, the words now etched in his mind. "There's no going back, Steve. No going back. You've made the right choice," Blackwell said softly, his voice carrying an air of finality. There was no enthusiasm, no celebration, just a statement of fact. And in his voice, Steve heard the undertones of a man who had seen this play out countless times before. "But understand this. What's coming next won't be easy. It's not about power or fame. It's about survival." Steve finally looked up, locking eyes with Blackwell. "Survival," he repeated, the word sounding strange on his tongue. "What do you mean?" Blackwell stood and walked to the window, staring out at the city below. The skyline stretched out before them, a patchwork of lights and shadows. "You think you've entered some grand arena, where you'll be the one in charge, pulling the strings. But you're wrong. This world is a game of survival, and you're just a player in it." Steve stood up, a fire igniting in him. "I didn't sign up to be a pawn, Blackwell. I'm not doing this to become just another piece on a chessboard. I want to make a difference. That was the whole point of warning Joe. I didn't want him to be part of this." Blackwell's smile was thin, amused even. "You still don't get it, do you?" he asked, his voice low but laced with an edge of mockery. "You were never in control, Steve. You've never been in control. The people who run this world, they don't care about you, about Joe, about any of it. They care about one thing: power. And you've just become a tool to help them maintain it." The words hit Steve like a slap. He had been so sure that his actions, his warning to Joe, had been the right thing to do. But now he was starting to question it. Had he been manipulated all along? Had he been so desperate for a sense of purpose that he hadn't seen what was really happening? "I didn't know," Steve muttered, more to himself than to Blackwell. "I didn't know it was like this." "No one does," Blackwell replied. "That's the beauty of it. People think they're making a difference, that they're changing things, when in reality, they're just adding fuel to the fire. The people at the top, they've engineered this entire system, and they've set it up so that no one, even the ones who think they're in control, can truly escape." Steve turned away, pacing the room. The air was suffocating, the walls closing in around him. He had walked into this world thinking he could be the hero, the one who brought justice. But now he wasn't so sure. Was there really any justice to be found here? Or was it all just a game, a cruel joke? What now? he asked, the words falling from his lips before he could stop them. What do I do now? Blackwell's eyes were steady, unwavering. Now you learn. You adapt. You learn how to play the game. You're not the one who decides who wins, Steve, but you can choose how you play. You can choose to be a pawn, or you can choose to be something more. Steve's chest tightened. The thought of becoming just another pawn in a game he couldn't control repulsed him. But what choice did he have? He couldn't go back. He couldn't unsee the things he had seen. He couldn't unlearn the truth. The harsh reality of the situation weighed heavily on his shoulders. You don't have the luxury of being innocent anymore. Do you really think I have a choice? Steve asked, the bitterness creeping into his voice. You've already made your decision for me, haven't you? Blackwell's expression softened, just a fraction. I never said you didn't have a choice, he said quietly. I said that you would have to learn how to navigate the system. But make no mistake, Steve. The game is already in motion. And it's too late to turn back now. There was a silence between them, thick with unspoken truths. Steve felt the walls pressing in on him, his breath coming in shallow gasps. This was it. The moment where his life shifted irrevocably. The moment where he crossed the line between being a bystander and becoming part of something much bigger. I won't lose myself in this, Steve muttered, his voice low but fierce. Blackwell didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood there for a moment, his gaze unreadable. We'll see, he said finally. We'll see how long that lasts. The words lingered in the air, heavy and ominous. And for the first time since entering this world, Steve wondered if he would ever find his way out of it, or if he was already too deep to even try. As the days went on, Steve's role in Blackwell's operation began to take shape. He wasn't just an observer anymore. He was part of the machinery. He attended meetings, listened in on calls, studied the faces of people he had once thought were untouchable. He learned how the world worked, how money and power moved behind closed doors, how lives were manipulated and discarded like pawns on a chessboard. But the more he learned, the more he realized something. He wasn't just a player. He was a tool. And the real players, the ones who pulled the strings, were the ones who had already decided his fate. He was in too deep now, with no way out. The system had already claimed him, just as it had claimed so many others. And as much as he hated it, he knew there was no going back. The price of knowing the truth was too high, and now he would have to pay it. It wasn't about changing the world. It was about surviving it. And Steve had learned that survival, true survival, came at a cost. Steve sat in the same chair, in the same dimly lit room, staring out at the same city skyline. His mind had become a blur of faces, decisions, and consequences. He had been part of something bigger, yes, but that had only made him feel smaller. The world outside felt distant, a place he couldn't quite reach anymore, no matter how hard he tried to stretch towards it. The door creaked open behind him, but Steve didn't turn. He didn't need to. He knew who it was. "You're thinking too much," Blackwell said, his voice as smooth as always. There was no warmth in it, no concern, just the matter-of-fact tone that Steve had come to dread. "I'm trying to figure it out," Steve replied, his voice flat. "Trying to make sense of all of this." Blackwell's footsteps grew louder as he approached. There was a slight pause, then the sound of a chair scraping across the floor as Blackwell sat down opposite Steve. "Sense? You won't find it here," Blackwell said with a quiet laugh. "This world isn't about making sense. It's about playing your part. It's about understanding that everyone has a role, and sometimes you have to accept that your role doesn't come with a script." Steve rubbed his eyes, exhaustion weighing heavily on him. "I didn't sign up for this," he muttered, more to himself than to Blackwell. "I just wanted to stop Joe from getting on that plane. I wanted to help him." Blackwell was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was measured. "You think the world is black and white, Steve. You think it's as simple as helping the good guys and stopping the bad ones. But it's never that easy. What you did for Joe, It wasn't about helping him. It was about making sure the right people stayed in power. It was about making sure things stayed the same. You were never going to change the world by trying to stop a single plane. You were part of the game before you even knew it. Steve's fists clenched in frustration. "I don't want to be part of the game anymore," he said, his voice rising. Blackwell's eyes narrowed, his face expressionless. "You think you can just walk away from it? You think you're the first person to ever think that? People like us, people who see behind the curtain, we don't get to walk away. We don't get the luxury of innocence. You're in this, whether you want to be or not. And trust me, Steve, there's no other way to live in this world." Steve stood up abruptly, his chair scraping back against the floor. He walked over to the window, staring at the bustling city below. It felt so far away, like a dream. A life he no longer recognized. His thoughts were like a whirlpool, everything spinning and swirling in confusion. "I thought I could make a difference," Steve whispered, almost to himself. I thought I could be the one to fix things. But now it's all just too much. I can't keep doing this. I can't keep pretending that I'm making some grand choice when all I'm doing is falling into someone else's plan." Blackwell's voice was calm, but laced with something like pity. "You weren't meant to fix anything, Steve. The world doesn't need you to fix it. It just needs you to play your part." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of the words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Steve could feel the finality of it, the truth he had been avoiding. He had been trapped in this world from the moment he had signed that paper. He had been caught in a system that wasn't meant to be changed. But then something inside him flickered, something deep and quiet, like the first breath of air after being submerged in water. Maybe Blackwell was right about one thing. Maybe the world wasn't going to change. But that didn't mean he had to accept it. Steve turned back to face him. His eyes were sharp, his voice steady. "I don't know if I can change the world. But I don't have to accept that it's too broken to be fixed. I don't have to be just another piece of the puzzle. I don't care if I'm part of the game. I'll play it, but I'll play it my way." Blackwell's gaze softened, but it wasn't with approval. It was something else. Recognition, perhaps, of the fire that was still burning inside Steve, a fire he had thought long extinguished. "You think you can win this, don't you?" he said quietly. Steve nodded slowly. "I don't know if I can win. But I can't keep pretending that doing nothing is the answer. If I'm going to be part of this, I'll play it differently. I'll make sure it means something." Blackwell stood up, his hands clasped behind his back. He seemed almost amused, but there was something in his eyes, something darker, harder, that Steve couldn't quite place. "You're a fool," Blackwell said, his voice almost affectionate. "But that's what makes you dangerous. And dangerous men can be useful." Steve didn't reply. He didn't need to. He had made his choice. As Blackwell walked out of the room, Steve remained by the window, staring at the city beneath him. The game was still in motion. The strings were still being pulled by forces beyond his control. But now, Steve knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't play the game the way they wanted him to. He might never be able to change the world, but he would carve out his own path, even if it meant walking through the darkness alone. The world might be broken, but he wasn't going to let it break him. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. The reflection in the glass looked back at him, a boy, not yet a man, but someone who had learned the hardest lesson of all. The world doesn't wait for you to be ready. It just moves forward, and you either keep up or get left behind. For now, Steve would keep up, and he would do it his way. The end for now. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, engage, subscribe, and stay connected. Let us know where you're watching from. Your thoughts matter. Stay tuned for more, and keep questioning the world around you. Don't leave without subscribing.